Sarah Chen stood at the edge of Thunder Ridge, her designer heels slipping on the loose gravel, her phone's GPS signal long gone. The corporate retreat that was supposed to revitalize her spirit had become a nightmare when she'd taken the wrong trail. Now, as darkness crept through the Colorado wilderness and her last protein bar wrapper fluttered away in the wind, she whispered the words that had haunted her for months. "I'm already dead inside anyway." But somewhere in the shadows of those towering pines, someone was watching. Someone who would prove that even the most broken souls could find their way back to life. This is the story of how a woman who had given up on everything met the man who refused to give up on her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Morrison & Associates had always felt like a glass cage to Sarah Chen, but today it felt more like a coffin. The quarterly projections glowed on the massive screen while her colleagues debated market penetration strategies, their voices blending into a meaningless drone that made her temples throb. She pressed her fingertips against the cool glass window, watching the tiny cars crawl through downtown Denver's streets far below, each one carrying people who probably remembered what it felt like to be alive. "Sarah, your thoughts on the Henderson account?" The voice of her supervisor, Marcus Whitfield, cut through her mental fog like a blade. She turned from the window, forcing her mouth into the practiced smile that had carried her. Through 3 years of climbing the corporate ladder at one of Colorado's most prestigious marketing firms, the Henderson account represents a significant opportunity for Q4 expansion, she heard herself say. The words flowing automatically while her mind remained somewhere else entirely. "We should leverage their seasonal promotional needs to create a multi-platform campaign that extends beyond traditional boundaries." Marcus nodded approvingly, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the fluorescent light. "Excellent insight. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking that landed you the promotion to Senior Vice President. The promotion." Sarah's stomach twisted as she remembered the celebration dinner her parents had insisted on throwing just 2 weeks ago. Her mother, Dr. Rebecca Chen, had beamed with pride as she told everyone at the Shanghai Palace restaurant how her daughter was the youngest SVP in Morrison & Associates history. Her father, Professor David Chen from UC Denver, had given one of his lengthy speeches about the importance of hard work and perseverance. They'd raised their glasses of expensive wine and toasted their daughter's success, never noticing the way she barely touched her food or how her hands shook when she reached for her water glass. Success. The word tasted bitter in her mouth now as she sat in her corner office later that afternoon, staring at the mahogany desk that had once represented everything she'd worked toward. The brass nameplate read, "Sarah Chen, Senior Vice President," in elegant script, but the letters seemed to mock her. She'd achieved everything she'd dreamed of since graduating summa cum laude from Northwestern with her MBA, yet she felt more empty than ever. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Jennifer Walsh, don't forget about the mandatory wellness retreat this weekend. Transport leaves Friday at 2 p.m., the wellness retreat." Morrison & Associates had made it mandatory for all senior staff after 3 employees had suffered stress-related breakdowns in the past 6 months. "Reconnect with nature, reconnect with yourself," the brochure had promised, featuring glossy photos of pristine mountain lakes and smiling executives practicing yoga on wooden decks. Sarah had read it with the same enthusiasm she might have shown for a root canal appointment. She spent the rest of Thursday in back-to-back meetings, her mind on autopilot as she discussed brand positioning strategies and budget allocations. Each presentation blended into the next, a kaleidoscope of pie charts and market analysis that meant nothing to her anymore. When her colleagues laughed at someone's joke about quarterly earnings, she laughed too, the sound hollow and mechanical. That evening, Sarah sat in her minimalist downtown loft, surrounded by the trappings of her success. The exposed brick walls showcased her collection of modern art. each piece carefully chosen by an interior designer who specialized in young professional aesthetics. The kitchen island held a bottle of wine that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. Instead, she stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights twinkle below like fallen stars, and wondered when everything had started feeling so meaningless. Her phone rang, interrupting the silence. The caller ID showed her best friend from college, Amanda Torres, calling from her home in Portland. "Sarah, how's the Big Shot VP doing?" Amanda's voice carried its usual warmth, but Sarah could barely manage a response. "Fine," she said, the lie coming easily. "Just busy with work. You always say that," Amanda laughed. "When's the last time you did something fun? Remember how we used to drive up to Mount Hood just to watch the sunrise? You were so different then, so alive. Alive." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to remember what that had felt like. In college, she'd been the one organizing weekend camping trips and midnight adventures. She'd been the friend who convinced everyone to take that spontaneous road trip to the Grand Canyon, who stayed up until dawn, talking about dreams and possibilities. That version of herself felt like a stranger now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when she made the mistake that would change everything. At what appeared to be a major trail junction, Sarah consulted her map and confidently chose what she believed was a shortcut back to the main loop. The path looked well-traveled, and there was even what looked like a trail marker partially hidden behind some brush. She congratulated herself on her navigation skills as she turned onto what she thought was the Meadowlark Trail's return route. But as the hours passed, the trail grew narrower and more overgrown. The confident markers she'd been following turned out to be old blazes from a trail that had been abandoned years ago. Her expensive GPS watch, which she'd relied on to track her progress, showed nothing but a weak signal and an increasingly concerning distance from the resort. The sun, which had been a pleasant presence earlier, began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows that turned the friendly forest into something darker and more mysterious. Sarah stopped at what might have been another trail junction, or might have just been a gap between trees, and felt the first real emotion she'd experienced in months: fear. Not the manageable anxiety of board presentations or budget meetings, but a primal terror that crept up her spine as she realized she was completely lost in wilderness that stretched for hundreds of square miles in every direction. She pulled out the emergency whistle they'd given her at the resort and blew 3 sharp blasts, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the vast silence of the mountains. No answering whistle came back, no voices calling her name. Just the wind through the pines and the distant cry of what might have been a hawk circling somewhere overhead. The temperature dropped with the sun, and Sarah's breath began forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. Her designer jacket, chosen more for its appearance than its functionality, offered little protection against the growing chill. She'd been walking in circles for what felt like hours, each turn revealing nothing but more unfamiliar terrain and deepening shadows. Panic clawed at her chest as she checked her expensive watch again. The resort dinner would be starting soon, and surely someone would notice her absence. But would they send search parties this late? How long would it take them to find her? The questions multiplied in her mind like a virus, each one spawning 3 more terrifying possibilities. She tried the emergency whistle again, the shrill sound echoing off distant rock faces before dying in the wilderness. Her throat felt raw from calling for help, and her voice had grown hoarse from shouting variations of "Hello! Can anyone hear me?" into the indifferent forest. As darkness settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, Sarah stumbled into a small clearing dominated by a massive boulder that jutted from the earth like a sleeping giant. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed against the cold stone, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been fighting. She was lost. Night was falling, and she had no idea how to survive in the wilderness. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a woman who controlled million-dollar marketing budgets and commanded respect in boardrooms across Colorado, reduced to a frightened child by something as simple as losing a trail. All her achievements, her corner office, her expensive possessions, none of it mattered now. The mountains didn't care about her MBA or her professional accomplishments. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her back against the boulder, trying to conserve what little body heat she had left. The forest around her filled with sounds she'd never heard in the city. Strange rustling in the underbrush, the distant howl of what might have been a coyote, and the whisper of wind through branches that sounded almost like voices in languages she couldn't understand. Her stomach cramped with hunger, reminding her that she'd barely touched the trail mix in her backpack. The protein bar she'd eaten earlier felt like a distant memory. But even as her body demanded food, her mind kept circling back to the same dark thought that had plagued her for months. Maybe this was fitting. Maybe getting lost and dying alone in the wilderness was just the universe's way of putting her out of her misery. I'm already dead inside anyway, she whispered to the darkness, the words she'd been thinking for months finally spoken aloud. They hung in the cold air like a confession, and for a moment Sarah felt a twisted sense of relief. At least now she was being honest. The temperature continued to drop, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she might not survive the night. She'd read stories about people dying from exposure in far less extreme conditions. Her expensive outdoor gear, hastily purchased online, suddenly felt inadequate against the mountain's indifferent cruelty. She was fumbling through her backpack, looking for anything that might help her stay warm. When she heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Bears, mountain lions. Her mind immediately conjured every wilderness horror story she'd ever heard, but then a low, gravelly voice emerged from the darkness. "You're a long way from anywhere, miss." Sarah's head snapped up and she squinted into the shadows beyond her small clearing. A figure materialized from between the trees, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in these mountains. In the dim starlight, she could make out the silhouette of a tall man, wearing what looked like worn leather and heavy canvas. A massive dog padded silently beside him, its eyes reflecting the faint light like golden coins. "Please don't hurt me," Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Every news story about dangerous drifters and mountain hermits flashed through her mind. The man stopped at the edge of the clearing, maintaining a respectful distance. "Not planning to, ma'am. My name's Jacob Reeves. This here's Thor," he said, gesturing to the dog. "We heard your whistle about 3 hours ago." 3 hours. Sarah's mind reeled. He'd been tracking her for 3 hours? "You're from the Pine Ridge Resort, aren't you?" Jacob continued, his voice surprisingly gentle despite its roughness. "They radioed the ranger station when you didn't come back for dinner. Half the county's looking for you." Sarah felt tears she didn't know she'd been holding back spill down her cheeks. "I got lost. I took what I thought was a shortcut and—" Her voice broke. "Trail markers got confused up here after the storm last month," Jacob said matter-of-factly. "Happens more than you'd think. You did good staying put once you realized you were off course." He moved closer, and Sarah could see him more clearly in the starlight. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair that looked like it hadn't seen a barber in months, and a beard that spoke of someone who lived by his own rules. His clothes were practical and worn, the kind of gear that came from years of actual use rather than expensive outdoor catalogs. "I'm going to build us a small fire," Jacob said, already gathering deadwood from around the clearing. "Get you warmed up before we head back down." "Us?" Sarah asked, confused. "Well, I can't leave you up here to freeze, can I?" Jacob's tone suggested that abandoning someone in need was simply not an option he would consider. "Besides, Thor's taken a liking to you, and he's a good judge of character." The dog had indeed moved closer, settling down near Sarah with a contented sigh. She reached out tentatively to touch his fur, finding it surprisingly soft and warm. Thor's tail thumped against the ground in approval. Jacob worked with practiced efficiency, arranging stones in a circle and building a small fire that caught on his first match. The flames cast dancing shadows around the clearing, transforming the threatening wilderness into something almost cozy. The warmth reached Sarah's face, and she felt her muscles beginning to relax for the first time in hours. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than any words she'd spoken in years. Jacob settled on the other side of the fire, pulling a thermos from his pack. "Coffee?" he offered. "It's still hot." The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, nothing like the elaborate lattes Sarah usually drank, but it tasted better than anything she could remember. As the warmth spread through her body, she found herself really looking at this man who had appeared from the wilderness, like something from a folk tale. "How did you know exactly where to find me?" she asked. "Tracking's not magic," Jacob replied, stirring the fire with a stick. "Just paying attention to what the mountain tells you. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, the way animals react to something that doesn't belong. You left a pretty clear trail once I knew where to start looking." "Are you a park ranger?" Jacob chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to harmonize with the crackling fire. "Used to be, long time ago. Now I just live up here, help out when folks get themselves turned around." There was something in his voice that suggested a story, but Sarah didn't press. Instead, she found herself talking, words spilling out of her like water from a broken dam. "I don't know why I'm even up here," she heard herself saying. "This whole retreat thing, it's supposed to help us find balance or reconnect with ourselves or whatever, but I don't think there's anything left to reconnect with." Jacob listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying the flames. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "I think you're looking for something you believe you've lost, but maybe it was never gone in the first place. Maybe it just got buried under other things." Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand. I used to feel things. I used to care about stuff, get excited about possibilities. Now I just go through the motions. I'm successful on paper, but inside I'm—" She struggled for the words. "Dead," Jacob supplied gently. The word hung between them, heavy with truth. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "Well," Jacob said, adding another piece of wood to the fire, "good thing death isn't permanent up here in the mountains." Jacob's cryptic words echoed in Sarah's mind as she stared into the hypnotic dance of flames. Death not being permanent in the mountains, what could he possibly mean? Before she could ask, he stood and began packing his gear with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown building the fire. "We should get moving," he said, shouldering his worn canvas pack. "The search teams will be getting worried, and some of those volunteers aren't as experienced as they think they are. Don't need more people getting themselves lost tonight." Sarah struggled to her feet, her muscles stiff from the cold and stress. The warmth from the fire had been temporary, and now the mountain chill cut through her expensive jacket like it was made of paper. Jacob noticed her shivering, and without a word, pulled a heavy wool blanket from his pack and draped it around her shoulders. "My grandmother made this," he said simply. "Navajo weaving. It's kept me warm through more nights than I can count." The blanket smelled of wood smoke and pine, with an underlying scent that spoke of years spent under open skies. Sarah pulled it closer, feeling its weight and warmth settle around her like a protective embrace. It was unlike anything she owned, rough, practical, made to last rather than to impress. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they began walking, Jacob leading with a sure-footed confidence that made the treacherous terrain seem manageable. "Why wouldn't I?" he replied, holding back a low branch so she could pass safely. "Folks help each other up here. It's not complicated." But Sarah found it was complicated, at least from her perspective. In her world, every action had an agenda. Every kindness came with a price tag or hidden motive. The idea that someone would spend hours tracking a lost stranger and share their warmth and food without expecting anything in return seemed almost alien. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, Thor padding ahead of them like a four-legged scout. Jacob moved through the darkness with an ease that suggested he could navigate these trails blindfolded, occasionally touching Sarah's elbow to guide her around obstacles she couldn't see. "How long have you lived up here?" Sarah asked, needing to break the silence that was filling with thoughts too dangerous to dwell on. "About 15 years, Jacob replied, pausing to check their direction against the stars visible through the canopy. "Came up here after my wife died. Thought I'd stay a few months, clear my head. Never left." The simple statement carried weight that Sarah could feel even without knowing the details. Loss. The kind of loss that changes the fundamental shape of a person's life. She wanted to ask more, but sensed that Jacob wasn't someone who shared personal details lightly. "What did you do before?" she ventured instead. "Emergency medicine. Trauma surgeon down in Colorado Springs. Spent 20 years putting people back together after the worst days of their lives." Jacob's voice carried no bitterness, just a matter-of-fact recounting. "Got good at fixing bodies. Never learned how to fix hearts." They emerged from the thick forest onto a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. In the distance, Sarah could see lights moving through the darkness, the search teams Jacob had mentioned. Flashlight beams swept back and forth, like mechanical fireflies, and she could hear the faint sound of voices calling her name. "All those people looking for me," Sarah said, a strange mix of guilt and wonder in her voice. "They don't even know me." "Doesn't matter," Jacob said, beginning the descent toward the lights. "Up here, we look out for each other. City folk, mountain folk, doesn't make a difference when someone needs help." As they picked their way down the slope, Sarah found herself thinking about the search volunteers who had given up their Saturday night to look for a stranger. When was the last time she had done something like that? When was the last time she had acted without calculating the personal benefit or professional advantage? The first search team they encountered was led by a young park ranger named Miguel Santos, whose relief was visible even in the darkness when he spotted them coming down the trail. "Thank God," Miguel breathed into his radio. "Base camp, this is Santos. I've got our missing person. Repeat. The subject is found and appears uninjured." The radio crackled with responses from other teams, voices filled with genuine relief and congratulations. Sarah listened to the chatter and realized that all these people had been genuinely worried about her, not because of her job title or her connections, but simply because she was a fellow human being who needed help. "Mom, are you injured?" Miguel asked, shining his flashlight quickly over Sarah to assess her condition. "Any pain, nausea, confusion?" "I'm fine," Sarah said, though she realized as she spoke that "fine" wasn't entirely accurate. She wasn't injured, but something fundamental had shifted in the hours since Jacob had found her. The crushing weight of emptiness that had been her constant companion for months felt different somehow. Not gone, but changed. The walk back to Pine Ridge Resort passed in a blur of concerned faces and gentle questions. Other search team members joined them along the way, and Sarah found herself surrounded by volunteers from the local community who had dropped everything to look for her. A retired teacher named Dorothy Williams pressed a thermos of hot soup into her hands. A local mechanic named Frank Morrison insisted on carrying her backpack, despite her protests that she was capable of handling it herself. "You gave us quite a scare," Dorothy said with maternal concern. "But that's what happens when city folks try to tackle mountain trails without proper preparation." Sarah expected to feel defensive at the comment, but instead found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months. "You're absolutely right," she admitted. "I had no idea what I was doing up there." "Most people don't, first time out," Frank added kindly. "Mountains have a way of humbling folks real quick, but they also have a way of teaching if you're willing to learn." Jacob had fallen back during the group walk, staying close enough to make sure Sarah was okay, but giving her space to interact with the other volunteers. She caught glimpses of him in the peripheral glow of flashlights, moving like a shadow through the forest that was clearly his home. When they finally reached the resort, the staff had hot coffee and medical attention waiting. The resort nurse, a competent woman named Lisa Patterson, insisted on checking Sarah's vital signs and looking for signs of hypothermia, despite her protests that she felt fine. "Your core temperature is lower than I'd like," Lisa said, wrapping Sarah in heated blankets. "And you're showing early signs of dehydration. You'll need to stay warm and drink plenty of fluids tonight." As Lisa worked, Sarah looked around for Jacob, but he seemed to have melted back into the darkness as quietly as he'd emerged from it. Only Thor remained visible, sitting patiently near the resort's entrance, as if waiting for something. "Where did he go?" Sarah asked Miguel, who was finishing up his incident report. "Jacob? Oh, he probably headed back up the mountain. He doesn't stick around for the paperwork and thank yous. Just does what needs doing and disappears again. But I didn't get to thank him properly," Sarah protested, surprising herself with how much this mattered to her. Miguel smiled. "Trust me, he knows you're grateful. That's not why he does it anyway." As the medical check concluded and the search teams began dispersing back to their homes and families, Sarah found herself standing alone on the resort's main deck, wrapped in blankets and staring up at the mountain peaks silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The events of the evening felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. Her colleagues from Morrison and Associates had been notified of her safe return, but they'd already retired to their rooms for the night. Tomorrow, there would be questions and concerned inquiries. But tonight, she was alone with thoughts that felt different than they had that morning. Jacob's words kept returning to her. "Good thing death isn't permanent up here in the mountains." She was beginning to understand what he might have meant. Something had died during her hours lost in the wilderness. Maybe her illusion of control, or her belief that she could navigate life's challenges through sheer professional competence. But something else had been born in those same hours. Something she couldn't yet name, but could feel stirring in her chest, like the first warmth of spring after a long winter. Thor appeared beside her suddenly, as if materializing from the shadows. The big dog sat down next to her and leaned against her leg, his warm presence both comforting and familiar. Around his neck was a leather collar with what looked like a small pouch attached. Sarah opened the pouch and found a folded piece of paper inside. By the deck's lamplight, she could see Jacob's careful handwriting. "The mountain isn't done with you yet. Neither am I. J.R." She looked up at the dark peaks towering above the resort, her heart beating with something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. Sunday morning arrived with a clarity Sarah hadn't experienced in years. She woke before her alarm, drawn to the window by golden sunlight that painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and rose. The corporate retreat was scheduled to end that afternoon, but Jacob's cryptic message had planted seeds of possibility in her mind that she couldn't ignore. At breakfast, her colleagues peppered her with questions about the previous night's adventure. Kevin Martinez seemed genuinely impressed by her survival story, while others treated it like an amusing anecdote to share back at the office. But Sarah found herself giving abbreviated answers, her attention drawn repeatedly to the windows that framed the wilderness beyond. "You seem different," observed Melissa Grant, the company's head of human resources, settling into the chair beside Sarah with her organic yogurt and granola. "More present somehow." Sarah paused, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Present. When was the last time someone had described her that way? In recent months, people had called her efficient, driven, successful but never present. "Maybe getting lost in the mountains gives you perspective," Sarah said, surprised by her own honesty. The morning's scheduled activities felt trivial after the previous night's experience. Group meditation sessions that had seemed meaningless before now felt actively insulting to the raw awakening she'd experienced in the darkness. When Patricia Hawthorne led them through trust exercises and guided visualizations about connecting with their authentic selves, Sarah wanted to laugh at the irony. She'd connected with something authentic in those terrifying hours alone. something that couldn't be captured in weekend retreat buzzwords. During the lunch break, Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable 48 hours earlier. She approached Patricia Hawthorne with a request that raised eyebrows around the resort. "I'd like to stay an extra day," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was asking. "I'll arrange my own transportation back to Denver." Patricia's expression shifted from professional concern to genuine curiosity. "The mountains got to you, didn't they?" "Something like that," Sarah replied. Her colleagues' reactions ranged from puzzled to worried. Marcus Whitfield pulled her aside, his supervisor's instincts clearly triggered by this departure from Sarah's usual predictable behavior. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, lowering his voice. "The Henderson presentation is first thing Tuesday morning, and you know how important that client is to the firm." The Henderson presentation. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she thought about the PowerPoint slides and market analysis waiting on her laptop back in Denver. But for the first time, the anxiety felt distant, like something happening to someone else. "I'll be ready for Tuesday," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. After the retreat bus departed with her colleagues aboard, Sarah found herself alone at Pine Ridge Resort for the first time. The sudden quiet felt different from the oppressive silence she'd experienced while lost. This was anticipatory silence, pregnant with possibilities she couldn't yet define. She changed out of her corporate retreat attire into the hiking gear she'd purchased online, clothes that had felt foreign just days before, but now seemed appropriate for whatever came next. The boots that had caused blisters during her misadventure felt more comfortable, broken in by her unintended wilderness experience. Thor appeared as she was lacing up her boots on the resort's main deck, padding out of the forest like he'd been summoned by her thoughts. He carried a small day pack in his mouth, dropping it at her feet before sitting back on his haunches with what could only be described as an expectant expression. Inside the pack, Sarah found basic trail supplies, water bottles, energy bars, a hand-drawn map of local trails, and another note in Jacob's careful handwriting: "If you're staying, you might as well see what you came here for. Follow Thor. Trust the process. J.R." The map showed trails she hadn't seen on the resort's official materials, paths that wound deeper into the wilderness, with names like Raven's Perch and Cathedral Falls. Red X marks indicated various points of interest, with notes scrawled in the margins: "Best sunrise view," and "Listen for the osprey here," and "Creek crossing, remove boots." Sarah shouldered the pack, its weight distributed more evenly than her expensive hiking backpack had been, and looked down at Thor. "I guess you're my guide today." The dog's tail wagged once. Then he turned and headed toward a trailhead that wasn't marked on any of the resort's official maps. Sarah followed, her heart beating with something that felt like the anticipation she'd experienced as a child on Christmas morning. The trail began gently, winding through stands of aspen, whose leaves rustled overhead like nature's wind chimes. But unlike her previous hike, this path felt intentional, each turn revealing new vistas or interesting rock formations. Thor moved at a steady pace that challenged Sarah without overwhelming her, occasionally looking back to ensure she was keeping up. After an hour of climbing, they emerged onto a rocky outcropping that offered a breathtaking view of the entire valley. Sarah could see Pine Ridge Resort far below, looking like a collection of toy buildings nestled among the trees. The scale of the landscape was humbling in a way that her corner office view had never been. Impressive, isn't it? Sarah spun around to find Jacob emerging from a cluster of pine trees, moving with the same quiet grace she was beginning to associate with him. He looked different in daylight, younger somehow, despite the grey in his hair and the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into mountain sunshine. "How did you know I'd come?" Sarah asked. "I didn't," Jacob said simply, settling onto a boulder that seemed placed there specifically for viewing the valley below. "But I hoped you would." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching clouds cast moving shadows across the mountainsides. Sarah found herself noticing details she would never have seen from her Denver office. The way the light changed color as it filtered through different types of trees, the patterns made by wind moving through tall grass. The distant cry of a hawk circling high above. "You said death isn't permanent in the mountains," Sarah said eventually. "What did you mean?" Jacob picked up a small stone and rolled it between his weathered fingers. "I meant that sometimes things need to die so other things can live. Old ways of seeing, old ways of being. The mountains have a way of stripping away everything that isn't essential, everything that isn't real. And what's left? That depends on what was there to begin with," Jacob said, his grey eyes meeting hers directly. "Some people find there's nothing left at all. Others discover they're made of stronger stuff than they realized." Sarah thought about the woman who had boarded the corporate retreat bus on Friday morning. Anxious, empty, going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly meaningless. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she might have known once but could barely remember being. "I used to love my work," she said, the words coming unbidden. "When I first started at Morrison & Associates, every project felt like a puzzle to solve. Every client presentation was a chance to create something meaningful. When did it all become so hollow?" "When you start measuring success by other people's definitions instead of your own," Jacob said without hesitation. "When the work stopped being about the work and started being about the promotion, the corner office, the recognition." His words stung because they carried the weight of truth. Sarah tried to remember the last time she'd felt genuine excitement about a marketing campaign or pride in helping a client reach their goals. Everything had become about climbing higher, earning more, proving herself in an endless competition that had no real finish line. "So, what do I do?" she asked. "I can't just walk away from everything I've built, can't you?" Jacob asked, but his tone wasn't challenging. It was genuinely curious, like he was asking her to examine an assumption she'd never questioned before. The question hung in the mountain air like morning mist, impossible to ignore, but difficult to grasp. Sarah had spent years building her career, accumulating achievements and accolades like armor against an undefined threat. The idea of walking away felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. "There's something I want to show you," Jacob said, standing and shouldering his pack. "But it requires a longer hike and some trust on your part." Sarah looked down at Thor, who had been lying patiently in the sunshine, and then back at Jacob. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about following a virtual stranger deeper into the wilderness. But rationality had gotten her a corner office and a profound sense of emptiness. Maybe it was time to try something else. "Lead the way," she said. The trail Jacob led them down wasn't marked on any map Sarah had ever seen. It wound through terrain that seemed untouched by human presence, where massive pine trees created a cathedral of shadows and dappled sunlight. The path itself was barely visible, more suggestion than actual trail, marked only by the occasional stone cairn or worn patch where countless animal hooves had passed. Thor ranged ahead of them, his movements purposeful as he navigated fallen logs and rocky stream crossings, with the confidence of someone following a familiar route. Sarah found herself matching Jacob's unhurried pace, her breathing steady despite the gradually increasing elevation. The expensive hiking boots she'd ordered online had somehow molded themselves to her feet during the previous day's adventure. And her legs felt stronger than they had in years. "Where exactly are we going?" Sarah asked as they paused beside a small waterfall that cascaded down a granite face worn smooth by centuries of flowing water. "Somewhere most people never see," Jacob replied, cupping his hands to drink from the pool at the waterfall's base. "My wife found it first about 20 years ago. She was a geologist, always poking around in places other people considered inaccessible. It was the first time Jacob had mentioned his wife with any detail, and Sarah sensed the weight of memory in his words. She wanted to ask more, but recognized that Jacob shared personal information like he did everything else, in his own time and on his own terms. They continued climbing, the terrain becoming more challenging as they ascended. Sarah's muscles worked in ways they hadn't since her college hiking days with Amanda, but instead of fatigue, she felt a growing sense of anticipation. Each switchback revealed new vistas, each elevation gain offered perspectives she'd never imagined possible. The corporate world she'd left behind that morning began to feel increasingly abstract. The urgent emails waiting in her inbox, the Henderson presentation looming on Tuesday, the quarterly projections that had consumed her thoughts for weeks, all of it seemed to exist in a different dimension, one that held less and less relevance with each step up the mountain. "Tell me about your wife," Sarah said during another rest stop, the question emerging before she could second-guess herself. Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Then he began speaking, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone sharing something precious and fragile. Elena was the kind of person who saw beauty in places other people saw only obstacles, he said. His eyes focused on the distant peaks. She could look at a rock formation and tell you the story of how it formed millions of years ago, or explain how glaciers carved out valleys like an artist sculpting marble. Everything was connected to her, the stones, the trees, the weather patterns, the wildlife. She saw the big picture in a way most people never learn to. They resumed walking, and Jacob continued his story as they climbed. Elena had been a research geologist for the U.S. Geological Survey, specializing in mountain formation and watershed systems. She and Jacob had met when he was working emergency medicine, and she'd been brought in after a rock climbing accident in Rocky Mountain National Park. She had a compound fracture in her leg and a concussion, but she spent the entire ambulance ride telling me about the mineral composition of the rocks she'd been climbing, Jacob said with a soft laugh. Even doped up on pain medication, she was teaching me about igneous formations and erosion patterns. Their romance had been built on weekend adventures to remote geological sites, with Elena sharing her passion for the natural world, while Jacob learned to see the mountains through her scientist's eyes. They'd married after 2 years and bought a small cabin near Colorado Springs, planning a life that would balance his medical career with her research and their shared love of wilderness exploration. What happened to her? Sarah asked gently as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "Cancer," Jacob said simply. "Lung cancer," which was ironic, since she never smoked a day in her life. But she'd spent years breathing rock dust and mineral particles in caves and mines. "Occupational hazard," the doctors said. The trail leveled out as they entered a high mountain meadow filled with wildflowers that shouldn't have been blooming so late in the season. Sarah stopped to catch her breath and found herself surrounded by colors she'd forgotten existed. Deep purples and brilliant yellows. Soft pinks and vibrant oranges that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Elena would have loved this, Jacob said, his voice carrying both sadness and joy. She always said that mountain meadows were proof that the world was more beautiful than it had any practical reason to be. They sat in the meadow for a while, sharing the trail food Jacob had packed and watching clouds build over the western peaks. Sarah found herself talking about her own past in ways she hadn't in years, sharing memories of college adventures and dreams she'd once harbored of traveling the world and making a difference through her work. "I used to think I'd run my own agency someday," she said, braiding wildflower stems between her fingers. Something small and focused, working with non-profits and companies that were actually trying to solve problems instead of just maximize profits. "What changed?" Jacob asked. Sarah considered the question seriously, tracing the path from her idealistic college graduation to her corner office at Morrison & Associates. "I guess I got practical. Student loans, rent, the pressure to prove myself in a competitive field. Every job I took was a step up the ladder, better money, more prestige. Somewhere along the way, the stepping stones became the destination, and now I make more money than I ever dreamed of. And I can't remember the last time I felt proud of anything I created," Sarah said, the admission carrying the weight of years of unexamined dissatisfaction. They resumed their climb in contemplative silence, the trail growing more challenging as they ascended above the tree line. The air grew thinner, and Sarah had to focus on her breathing, but she felt stronger rather than weaker. Each step seemed to strip away another layer of the protective numbness she'd wrapped around herself during the past months. The destination Jacob had been leading them toward revealed itself gradually as they crested a ridge that opened onto a hidden valley unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Towering granite spires rose from a pristine alpine lake that reflected the sky so perfectly it was difficult to tell where the water ended and the air began. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock faces, and natural hot springs sent wisps of steam into the cool mountain air. "This is Elena's place," Jacob said, his voice reverent. "She discovered it during a geological survey 15 years ago and never reported the location, said some places were too special to share with the world." Sarah walked to the edge of the lake, her reflection wavering in the crystal-clear water. Fish moved in the depths like living shadows, and she could see the rocky bottom 30 feet down with perfect clarity. The silence was profound, but not empty, filled instead with the subtle sounds of wind through stone and the distant call of birds she couldn't identify. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Jacob sat on a boulder worn smooth by centuries of weather, Thor settling beside him with a contented sigh. "Because Elena used to say that some people spend their whole lives looking for places like this in geography when they really exist inside themselves. She believed that everyone has a hidden valley, a place of perfect clarity where they can see who they really are without all the noise and distraction of the world." As the afternoon wore on, Jacob shared more stories about Elena and their life together. He told Sarah about the research expeditions that took them to remote corners of the Colorado Rockies, about evenings spent around campfires, while Eleanor explained the geological forces that had shaped the landscape they were exploring. "She was working on a book when she got sick," Jacob said, his voice growing quieter. "A guide to the hidden geology of Colorado, all the places most people never see. She wanted to share the wonder she felt about these mountains, help people understand that they were walking on stories written in stone across millions of years." "Did she finish it?" "The research, yes. The writing, no. That's part of why I stayed up here after she died. Thought I might finish it for her, honor her work somehow." Jacob picked up a smooth stone from the lakeshore and skipped it across the water's surface. "But I discovered I'm better at living her discoveries than writing about them." As evening approached, they built a small fire using driftwood that had somehow found its way to this high alpine lake. The flames reflected off the granite walls, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance in rhythm with the mountain wind. Sarah found herself mesmerized by the interplay of fire and stone, water and sky. "I have something for you," Jacob said, reaching into his pack and pulling out a leather-bound journal that showed signs of years of use. "Elena always said that the mountains only reveal their secrets to people who are willing to pay attention. She kept notes about everything she saw, not just the geology, but the way light fell on rock faces, how weather patterns moved through valleys, what it felt like to stand in places where few humans had ever been." Sarah accepted the journal with reverence, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. The pages inside were filled with Elena's careful handwriting, detailed sketches of rock formations, pressed wildflowers, and observations about the natural world that revealed a mind constantly engaged with beauty and wonder. "I can't take this," Sarah said, trying to hand it back. "This belonged to your wife." "Elena believed that knowledge was meant to be shared," Jacob replied, gently pushing the journal back toward her. "She would want someone to continue learning from these places, asking questions, paying attention to details that most people miss." Sarah opened the journal randomly and found herself reading an entry dated 5 years earlier. "Discovered a hidden meadow today at 9,800 feet elevation. Jacob thinks I'm crazy to climb that high just to look at flowers, but he doesn't understand that every wildflower is a miracle of adaptation, a perfect solution to the puzzle of surviving at altitude. The alpine forget-me-nots here are bluer than any color I've seen in the lower elevations. Made me think about how beauty often requires difficulty, how the most spectacular things in life grow in the harshest conditions. The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. Beauty requiring difficulty, spectacular things growing in harsh conditions. She thought about her own life, how she'd spent years seeking comfort and security, building walls against difficulty rather than finding ways to thrive within it. "Jacob," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think I know how to pay attention anymore. I don't know how to see what Elena saw, feel what she felt." "That's not true," Jacob replied, stirring the fire with a stick. "You saw those volunteers who searched for you yesterday, not as networking opportunities or potential business contacts, but as people who cared enough to help a stranger. You felt grateful in a way that surprised you, because you'd forgotten that gratitude was possible." Sarah thought about the search and rescue volunteers, their genuine concern and willingness to sacrifice their Saturday night for someone they'd never met. She realized Jacob was right. She had felt something authentic in that moment, something that had nothing to do with professional advancement or social positioning. The woman who got lost on Friday was looking for something outside herself to fix what felt broken inside, Jacob continued. The woman sitting here now is starting to understand that the fixing has to come from within, and that maybe what felt broken was just buried under years of trying to be someone else's version of successful. As full darkness settled over the hidden valley, the stars emerged with an intensity that took Sarah's breath away. Without the light pollution of Denver, the sky revealed depths and complexities she'd forgotten existed. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and Sarah felt herself becoming smaller and larger simultaneously. Tiny, in the face of cosmic immensity, but also connected to something vast and eternal. "I need to make some changes," Sarah said, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised her. "I can't go back to Morrison and Associates and pretend that nothing has happened up here." "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "But for the first time in years, not knowing feels like a beginning rather than a failure." They spent the night beside Elena's lake, sleeping under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Sarah dreamed of geological time and hidden valleys, of wildflowers growing in impossible places, and the patient persistence of water carving stone into beauty. Dawn came slowly to Elena's valley, creeping over the granite peaks like watercolors bleeding across wet paper. Sarah woke to find herself wrapped in Jacob's grandmother's Navajo blanket, the wool having kept her warm throughout the mountain night. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and Thor lay curled against her back, his steady breathing and warmth having served as an additional barrier against the cold. Jacob was already awake, sitting by the lake's edge with Elena's journal open in his lap. In the morning light, Sarah could see him more clearly than ever before, the way his weathered hands held the book with reverence, the careful attention he paid to each page, as if he were having a conversation with memories made tangible. "She wrote about this exact sunrise," Jacob said, without turning around, his voice carrying across the still water. "July 15th, 3 years ago, said the way the light hits those eastern cliffs makes them look like they're glowing from within." Sarah joined him at the water's edge, accepting the cup of coffee he offered from his thermos. The brew was strong and bitter, nothing like her usual elaborate espresso drinks, but it tasted perfect in this setting. As she watched, the sun crested the peaks and transformed the granite faces into sheets of gold and amber, exactly as Elena had described. "She was right," Sarah murmured, understanding for the first time what Elena had meant about paying attention. This wasn't just a sunrise. It was a daily miracle of physics and beauty that most people would sleep through or ignore in their rush to get to work. Elena used to say that the mountains were her church, Jacob continued, closing the journal and setting it carefully beside him. Not in any religious sense, but because they reminded her that there were forces at work in the world far greater and more enduring than human concerns. She found peace in geological time. The idea that these peaks had been building and eroding for millions of years, that they'd continue long after we were gone. Sarah sipped her coffee and contemplated this perspective. Her entire professional life had been built around quarterly reports and annual goals, the frantic pace of modern business that treated every deadline as life or death urgent. The idea of thinking in million-year timescales felt both humbling and liberating. "I need to tell you something," she said, surprised by her own decision to share. "Yesterday, when I decided to stay an extra day, I lied to my supervisor about being ready for the Henderson presentation on Tuesday." Jacob's expression didn't change, but she sensed his attention sharpening. "What happens if you're not ready?" "I could lose the account. Maybe my job." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she spoke, but it was distant now, like an old injury that ached before storms. "The Henderson Group represents $8 million in annual billing. It's the kind of client that makes careers. And now—" Sarah stared across the mirror-smooth lake, watching a fish create expanding circles on the surface as it rose to take an insect. The ripples spread outward in perfect concentric rings until they reached the shore at her feet, connecting her to that moment of life and hunger in the depths. "Now I'm sitting beside a hidden lake at dawn, drinking coffee with a man who found me lost in the wilderness. And I can't remember why any of that other stuff felt so important." She turned to face Jacob directly. "That scares me more than losing my job." "Why?" "Because I don't know who I am without the work, without the achievements and the recognition. I've spent so many years becoming successful that I forgot to become myself." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously. Jacob stood and walked to a flat boulder that jutted into the lake, settling into a cross-legged position that suggested years of practice. "Elena used to meditate here every morning when we came to this place. Said it helped her remember that she was part of something larger than her own thoughts and worries." "I don't know how to meditate," Sarah confessed. "It's not complicated. Just sit quietly and pay attention to what's actually happening, instead of what you think should be happening." Sarah joined him on the boulder, feeling awkward as she attempted to mirror his relaxed posture. Her mind immediately began generating the familiar stream of concerns and calculations that had become its default mode. Flights back to Denver, emails to return, presentations to prepare. But gradually, surrounded by the profound stillness of the valley, the mental chatter began to quiet. She became aware of sensations she'd been ignoring, the coolness of morning air on her face, the solid weight of stone beneath her, the sound of water lapping gently against the shore. A bird called from somewhere across the lake, its voice echoing off the granite walls in layers of sound that seemed to hang in the thin air. "What do you hear?" Jacob asked softly. "Water, wind, that bird." Sarah paused, listening more carefully. "My own heartbeat." Thor's breathing. "Something that might be a waterfall in the distance. What do you feel?" "Cold air, warm sun on my hands, the roughness of this rock." She became aware of other sensations as she spoke. Tension in my shoulders that I didn't realize was there. Hunger in my stomach, something in my chest that feels lighter than it has in months. They sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah found herself entering a state she'd never experienced before, fully present, but without the urgent need to analyze or control what was happening. Her thoughts became like clouds passing across the sky, visible but not demanding immediate attention. When they finally opened their eyes, the sun had climbed higher and the valley had filled with the busy sounds of day. Birds calling, insects humming, the distant chatter of what might have been a squirrel scolding something from high in the pine trees that clung to the valley walls. How do you feel? Jacob asked. Sarah took inventory of herself, surprised by what she found. Different, calmer, like I've been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. Jacob smiled, the first genuinely joyful expression she'd seen from him. Elena used to say that most people spend their lives in a state of chronic emergency, treating every minor stress like a life-threatening crisis. She believed that places like this existed to remind us what peace actually feels like. As the morning progressed, Jacob began teaching Sarah to see the valley through Eleanor's eyes. He showed her how to identify different types of granite by their crystal structures, how to read the story of ancient glaciers in the shape of the surrounding peaks, how to recognize the signs of wildlife that used the valley as a corridor between higher and lower elevations. Sarah found herself taking notes in Elena's journal, adding her own observations to pages that already contained years of careful documentation. Her handwriting looked strange alongside Elena's precise scientific notations, but Jacob encouraged her to record whatever caught her attention. Elena always said that everyone sees something different in nature, he explained, as Sarah sketched a wildflower she couldn't identify. The geologist sees rock formations and mineral deposits. The biologist sees ecosystems and adaptation strategies. The artist sees color and form and light. None of them are wrong. They're just looking through different lenses. What do I see? Sarah asked, studying her rough sketch. You tell me. Sarah looked around the valley with fresh attention, trying to articulate what drew her eye and stirred something in her chest. I see. Persistence, she said finally. Everything here has found a way to thrive in conditions that should be impossible. These flowers growing in rock cracks, trees clinging to cliff faces, this lake existing at an elevation where it should freeze solid most of the year. It's like nature's version of entrepreneurship, finding opportunities where others see only obstacles. Jacob nodded approvingly. That's your lens. The business strategist sees innovation and adaptation in natural systems. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about her conversation with Amanda Torres, her college friend who'd asked when she'd last done something fun. Sitting beside this hidden lake, learning to identify animal tracks in the sandy shoreline and listening to Jacob's stories about Elena's discoveries, Sarah realized she was having fun for the first time in years. Not the manufactured enjoyment of team-building exercises or corporate social events, but genuine curiosity and delight in learning something new. Jacob, she said, as they shared a lunch of trail mix and jerky, what made you decide to stay up here after Elena died? Wasn't it lonely? Jacob considered the question while watching a hawk circle high above the valley. At first, yes. The loneliness was crushing. I'd spent 20 years sharing everything with Elena. Every thought, every discovery, every moment of wonder or beauty. When she died, I didn't know how to experience things alone. He paused, throwing a small stone into the lake and watching the ripples spread outward. But gradually, I realized that she'd taught me how to see, really see, the world around me. The loneliness began to feel less like abandonment and more like independence. I could sit with a sunset or a thunderstorm and feel Elena's presence in my ability to appreciate what I was witnessing. Do you ever think about going back to medicine? Sometimes. But trauma surgery is a young person's game, and I'm not sure I have the emotional resilience for it anymore. Up here, I help people in different ways. Finding lost hikers, teaching wilderness skills, maintaining trails that connect people to places like this. Sarah thought about her own profession, the endless cycle of campaigns and presentations and client meetings that had consumed her adult life. When had she last helped someone in a way that mattered? When had her work created something beautiful or meaningful rather than just profitable? I think I want to quit my job, she said, the words emerging before she could stop them. Jacob's expression remained neutral, but she sensed his attention focusing on her completely. What would you do instead? I don't know. That's the terrifying part. Sarah picked up Elena's journal and flipped through pages filled with sketches and observations, scientific data mixed with personal reflections on beauty and wonder. But I know I can't go back to sleepwalking through a life that doesn't feel like mine anymore. What does it feel like yours? Sarah looked around the valley, trying to articulate the sense of rightness she'd experienced during the past 2 days. This being present, learning about things that matter more than quarterly profits, using my skills to help people and causes I actually care about. The non-profit agency you mentioned yesterday? Maybe, or maybe something completely different. Elena's journal is full of references to environmental organizations that were fighting to protect wilderness areas. What if there are businesses trying to do good work but lacking the marketing expertise to reach people effectively? For the first time since leaving college, Sarah felt the stirring of genuine, professional excitement, not the hollow satisfaction of landing a prestigious client or earning a promotion, but the anticipation of using her talents for something that aligned with her values. There's a woman in Boulder, Jacob said thoughtfully, who runs an organization dedicated to protecting high-altitude ecosystems. Elena consulted with them occasionally, providing geological data for their conservation efforts. They're always struggling with funding and public awareness, exactly the kind of problems your marketing background might help solve. Sarah felt a surge of possibility that was unlike anything she'd experienced in years. Could you introduce me? If that's what you want, what she wanted. Sarah realized that she hadn't asked herself that question in years. Everything had been about what she should want, what success looked like to others, what her parents expected or her colleagues respected. But sitting beside Elena's lake, surrounded by evidence of life thriving in impossible conditions, she began to understand what authentic desire felt like. "I want to matter," she said simply. "I want my work to create something beautiful and meaningful, not just profitable. I want to wake up excited about the day ahead, instead of dreading another round of meetings and presentations about products I don't believe in." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Jacob started preparing for their return journey to the resort. But Sarah found herself reluctant to leave the valley, sensing that something fundamental would change the moment they descended back into the world of cell phone signals and email notifications. "This place will always be here," Jacob said, reading her hesitation. "Elena used to say that once you've seen your hidden valley, you carry it with you wherever you go. The peace, the clarity, the sense of connection, it becomes part of who you are." Sarah took one last look around the valley, memorizing the way afternoon light turned the granite cliffs to gold, the perfect mirror of the lake's surface, the wildflowers that had found ways to bloom in rocky soil. She opened Elena's journal and wrote a final entry for the day: "Found my hidden valley today." Not just the physical place, but the internal space where I can remember who I am, beneath all the layers of who I thought I should be. Elena was right. Some discoveries change you at a cellular level. I'm not the same person who got lost on Friday night. I'm not sure who I'm becoming, but for the first time in years, that uncertainty feels like promise rather than threat. The descent from Elena's valley felt like traveling between worlds. With each step down the mountain, Sarah could feel the pull of her old life growing stronger, the weight of expectations, deadlines, and professional obligations that waited for her in Denver. But something had fundamentally shifted during her night beside the hidden lake. The corporate anxiety that had been her constant companion felt distant now, like background noise she could finally choose to ignore. Jacob moved ahead of them on the trail, his familiarity with the terrain allowing him to navigate the steep descents with fluid grace. Thor bounded between them, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush before reappearing with sticks or interesting scents that demanded investigation. Sarah found herself moving with more confidence than she'd possessed just days earlier, her body having adapted to the rhythm of wilderness travel. "Tell me about the woman in Boulder," Sarah said. as they paused at a switchback that offered views of the valley floor far below. "The one who runs the conservation organization, Dr. Maria Vasquez," Jacob replied, settling onto a fallen log and pulling out his water bottle. "She's a wildlife biologist who started the High Country Conservation Alliance about 10 years ago. Elena worked with her on several projects documenting how climate change was affecting alpine ecosystems." Sarah pulled Elena's journal from her pack and found a clean page, ready to take notes. The act of writing in the worn leather book still felt sacred, but Jacob's encouragement had helped her understand that knowledge was meant to be shared and built upon. What kind of work does her organization do? Habitat protection mainly. They identify critical wildlife corridors and work to prevent development that would fragment migration routes. They also do education programs, trying to help people understand how human activities at lower elevations affect high-altitude environments. Jacob's description sparked something in Sarah's mind, the same strategic thinking that had made her successful. At Morrison and Associates, but applied to causes that actually mattered to her. She could see the marketing challenges immediately. How do you make people care about ecosystems they've never seen? How do you compete for attention and funding against more visible causes? What's their biggest challenge? She asked. Same as most non-profits, funding and awareness. Maria's brilliant at the science, but she struggles to translate complex ecological concepts into messages that resonate with donors and policymakers. She's told me she feels like she's speaking a foreign language half the time. Sarah felt a familiar excitement building. The same rush she'd experienced in college when she'd discovered how marketing could be used to advance social causes. But this time, the enthusiasm felt authentic rather than calculated, driven by genuine passion rather than career advancement. Would you really introduce me to her? If you're serious about making a change, yes. Jacob studied her face carefully. But you should understand that non-profit work isn't just a different version of corporate marketing. The budgets are smaller, the hours are longer, and the victories come slowly. It's not glamorous work. I don't think I want glamorous anymore, Sarah said, surprised by her own certainty. I want something meaningful. They resumed their descent, the conversation turning to practical considerations that Sarah had been avoiding. Her apartment lease in Denver, her substantial savings account, her parents' likely reaction to her career change. Each topic felt manageable in ways that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. My parents are going to think I've lost my mind, Sarah admitted, as they navigated a particularly rocky section of trail. They sacrificed everything for my education, worked extra jobs to pay for my MBA. To them, walking away from a senior vice president position will look like I'm throwing away everything they invested in. Are you? Jacob asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. No. I'm using everything they taught me about hard work and perseverance, just applying it to different goals. The skills are the same. It's the purpose that's changing. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the mountainside, they encountered other hikers for the first time since leaving the resort. A family from Texas was struggling with the altitude and questionable gear choices, their teenage daughter complaining loudly about the distance back to their car. Jacob immediately shifted into helper mode, sharing water and offering route advice with the same quiet competence he'd shown during Sarah's rescue. Watching him interact with the struggling family, Sarah gained new insights into Jacob's character. He helped not because he had to, or because it would benefit him somehow, but because it was simply the right thing to do. The concept felt revolutionary after years in a corporate environment where every action was calculated for maximum personal advantage. You do that a lot? Sarah observed after the family had continued on their way. Do what? Help strangers without expecting anything in return. Jacob looked genuinely puzzled by the observation. Why wouldn't I help them? They needed assistance, and I had knowledge that could make their day easier. His matter-of-fact response highlighted how far Sarah had drifted from her own natural impulses toward generosity and connection. When had she become someone who calculated the cost-benefit ratio of simple kindness? As they approached the final descent toward Pine Ridge Resort, Sarah's phone began buzzing with the digital demands of her postponed life. Text messages from colleagues, missed calls from clients, email notifications stacking up like reproaches for her brief abandonment of professional responsibilities. "You don't have to answer those now," Jacob said, noticing her instinctive reach toward her phone. "I know. But Tuesday morning is going to arrive, whether I'm ready or not." Sarah scrolled through the messages, her stomach tightening with each urgent subject line. The Henderson group called 3 times. "Marcus wants to schedule a preparation meeting first thing Monday morning." The familiar weight of professional anxiety began settling on her shoulders, like a heavy coat she'd forgotten she was wearing. But underneath the surface stress, Sarah noticed something different, a core of calm that hadn't been there before, a sense of perspective that made even urgent deadlines feel less catastrophic. "What will you tell them?" Jacob asked. "I don't know yet, but I know I can't pretend nothing has changed up here." They reached the resort. As the dinner bell was ringing, the sound of civilization both welcoming and jarring after their time in the wilderness. Sarah's room felt cramped and artificial after sleeping under stars beside Elena's lake, and the carefully curated wilderness decor seemed like a pale imitation of the authentic natural beauty she'd experienced. She showered and changed into clean clothes, but looking in the mirror felt strange. Her face had acquired color from 2 days of mountain sun, and there was something different in her eyes, a clarity that hadn't been there when she'd arrived for the corporate retreat. She looked like someone who had traveled a great distance, which she supposed she had, even if most of the journey had been internal. Dinner in the resort's main dining room felt surreal. The other guests discussed their weekend wellness experiences with enthusiasm that sounded hollow to Sarah's newly sensitive ears. Conversations about digital detox breakthroughs and finding balance through nature connection seemed to miss the point entirely. They were treating the mountains like a spa treatment rather than a teacher. Jacob had declined her invitation to join her for dinner, explaining that he preferred to maintain his solitude and would be heading back up the mountain that evening. But he'd promised to contact Dr. Maria Vasquez and arrange an introduction if Sarah decided to pursue the conservation work seriously. "How will I reach you?" Sarah had asked as they parted ways outside the resort. "You won't need to reach me," Jacob had replied with a slight smile. "The mountains will bring us together again if it's meant to happen." Now, sitting alone at a table overlooking the valley where she'd been lost just 2 nights earlier, Sarah pulled out Elena's journal and began writing. The words flowed easily, as if the mountain air had cleared blockages in her mind that she hadn't even realized existed. "The hardest part isn't deciding to change," she wrote. "It's trusting that the person I'm becoming is worth the risk of abandoning the person I've spent years becoming." Elena wrote about geological transformation, how mountains are constantly being reshaped by forces that work slowly but inevitably. "I think people can transform the same way, grain by grain, choice by choice, until one day they wake up and realize they've become someone entirely different." Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from her assistant Jennifer. "Sarah, Marcus needs the Henderson preliminary presentation by 9 a.m. Monday for review before client meeting. Should I book a conference room for early prep session?" Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then typed her response. "Tell Marcus I'll have everything ready, but also clear my calendar for Thursday afternoon. I may have some personal business to attend to." Thursday afternoon. That would give her time to handle her immediate professional obligations while also exploring the conversation with Dr. Vasquez that Jacob had offered to arrange. It felt like a reasonable compromise between responsible professional behavior and authentic personal growth. But as she sent the message, Sarah realized that compromise might not be enough. The woman who had boarded the retreat bus on Friday morning might have been satisfied with minor adjustments and gradual change. The woman writing in Eleanor's journal by lamplight felt ready for something more dramatic. She spent the evening reading Elena's entries about the High Country Conservation Alliance, learning about projects to protect wildlife corridors and restore damaged alpine habitats. Elena's scientific observations were interspersed with personal reflections that revealed her passion for the work. Worked with Maria today on mapping critical habitat for the white-tailed ptarmigan population. These birds are climate refugees, forced higher and higher up the mountain as temperatures rise. Maria calls them canaries in the coal mine for alpine ecosystems. When they disappear, we'll know we've lost something irreplaceable. But she also talks about hope, about creating protected corridors that might give these species room to adapt. I love her combination of scientific rigor and stubborn optimism. Sarah found herself imagining what it would be like to work alongside someone with that combination of expertise and hope. After years of creating marketing campaigns for products she didn't believe in, the idea of promoting conservation work felt like coming home to herself. She called the airline and changed her Monday morning flight to Tuesday afternoon, giving herself an extra day in Colorado to explore possibilities that had seemed unthinkable just 72 hours earlier. The change fee was substantial, but for the first time in years, Sarah found herself making financial decisions based on values rather than pure cost-benefit analysis. Sleep came easier than it had in months. Despite the huge questions hanging over her future, Sarah dreamed of hidden valleys and granite spires, of wildflowers growing in impossible places and clear mountain lakes that reflected not just the sky above, but possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. She woke before dawn, drawn to the window by the same instinct that had pulled her from sleep beside Elena's lake. The eastern peaks were beginning to glow with the first hints of sunrise, and Sarah found herself automatically reaching for Elena's journal to record her observations. "Day 4 of my mountain education," she wrote. "Yesterday I thought I was descending back to my old life, but I think I was actually climbing towards something new." Jacob said, Elena believed that some people spend their whole lives looking for their hidden valleys in geography when they really exist inside themselves. "I think I'm finally ready to explore that internal landscape, even if it means leaving behind everything I thought I wanted." The sunrise painted the mountains in shades of gold and rose, and Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the uncertainty ahead. For once, not knowing what came next felt like the beginning of an adventure rather than a source of anxiety. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt appropriate for whatever conversation awaited her, professional enough to be taken seriously, but comfortable enough for whatever terrain her life might cross in the coming days. As she packed Elena's journal in her day bag, Sarah realized she was preparing for more than just a meeting about potential career change. She was preparing to meet the person she might become Monday. Morning descended on Denver with the relentless efficiency of a corporate machine grinding back to life. Sarah sat in her corner office at Morrison & Associates, surrounded by the familiar trappings of success that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The expensive modern furniture, the carefully chosen artwork, the view of downtown Denver spreading out 42 floors below, all of it seemed diminished after spending 3 days surrounded by mountain peaks that had been ancient when this city was still prairie grass. Her colleagues had greeted her return with the usual mix of professional curiosity and barely concealed envy. Kevin Martinez had peppered her with questions about the wilderness retreat, clearly hoping for amusing anecdotes about corporate executives struggling with outdoor activities. Melissa Grant had commented on Sarah's improved complexion and asked about the spa treatments, apparently unable to imagine that the glow came from sleeping under stars rather than expensive skincare. But it was Marcus Whitfield's reaction that proved most telling. Her supervisor had taken one look at her and frowned, his sharp instincts detecting something different in her demeanor. "You look rested," he said, making it sound like an accusation. I hope that means you're ready to tackle the Henderson presentation with renewed energy. I'm ready, Sarah had replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was ready for. Now, at 7:30 a.m., she sat in conference room A with the Henderson Group materials spread across the mahogany table, feeling like an actor preparing to perform a role she'd outgrown. The marketing strategy she'd developed before the retreat was solid, innovative even, but it felt hollow in ways that had nothing to do with its professional merit. The Henderson Group manufactured outdoor, recreational equipment, ironically enough, expensive camping gear and hiking accessories marketed to weekend warriors who wanted to experience nature without actually roughing it. Sarah's campaign strategy focused on selling them a sanitized version of wilderness adventure, complete with social media-friendly photo opportunities and Instagram-worthy gear shots. After spending 2 nights actually sleeping outdoors with minimal equipment, the disconnect felt almost absurd. She thought about Jacob's worn canvas pack, his grandmother's Navajo blanket, the simple efficiency of gear chosen for function rather than fashion. The Henderson Group's product line suddenly seemed designed to separate people from authentic experiences rather than facilitate them. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown. "Colorado number, this is Maria Vasquez. Jacob Reeves suggested we might have mutual interests to discuss. Are you available for a call this afternoon? Dr. V." The message sent a jolt of electricity through Sarah's chest, part excitement, part terror. This was it, the concrete step toward the possibility Jacob had offered. She could respond professionally, arrange a convenient time, begin the careful process of exploring career alternatives. Or she could delete the message and pretend the conversation in Elena's Valley had never happened. Sarah typed her response before she could reconsider. "Yes, very interested. Available after 3 p.m. today. Thank you for reaching out." She sent the message and immediately felt the familiar corporate anxiety spike. But underneath it was something steadier, a sense of rightness that made the professional fears feel manageable. Marcus arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying his usual arsenal of red pens and critical observations. He settled into his chair with the authority of someone who'd built his career on finding flaws in other people's work. "Walk me through the strategy," he said without preamble. Sarah launched into her presentation, her voice automatically adopting the confident tone she'd perfected over years of client meetings. She discussed target demographics and brand positioning, social media integration, and influencer partnerships. The words flowed smoothly, but she felt disconnected from them, as if she were reading someone else's script. The core message focuses on adventure accessibility. She explained, clicking through carefully designed slides. "We're positioning Henderson products as the bridge between urban comfort and outdoor experience. The tagline is, 'Bring your comfort zone with you.'" Marcus nodded approvingly, making notes in his precise handwriting. "Good angle. Appeals to their aspirational desires without triggering anxiety about genuine hardship. What about the social media component?" Sarah continued through the presentation, outlining campaigns that would encourage customers to share photos of themselves using Henderson products in scenic locations. Everything was designed to maximize brand visibility while minimizing actual outdoor competence required from users. The genius is in making outdoor recreation feel achievable for people who are intimidated by the real thing, Sarah concluded. "We're selling them a curated wilderness experience." "Excellent work," Marcus said, closing his folio with satisfaction. "This should secure the Henderson account for the next 3 years at minimum. I'll set up the client presentation for tomorrow morning." As Marcus left to brief the senior partners, Sarah remained alone in the conference room, staring at her presentation materials. The strategy was undeniably clever, likely to win awards and generate substantial revenue. It represented everything she'd trained for, everything she'd supposedly wanted to achieve in her career. So why did she feel like she'd just betrayed something sacred? The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks and administrative details, but Sarah's mind kept drifting to Elena's journal and the entries she'd read about authentic engagement with wilderness. Elena had written about the difference between experiencing nature and consuming it, between learning from the mountains and simply using them as backdrops for social media. At lunch, Sarah escaped to a small park near the office building, needing open sky and growing things after hours under fluorescent lights. She pulled out Elena's journal and found an entry that seemed written specifically for her current situation. Attended a conference today where outdoor gear companies were showcasing innovations that seemed designed to eliminate every challenge and discomfort that might actually teach people something about themselves. One booth was promoting a tent that sets itself up automatically, eliminating the satisfaction of mastering basic outdoor skills. Another was marketing freeze-dried meals that taste exactly like restaurant food, removing the simple pleasure of appreciating basic nutrition after physical exertion. I understand the appeal of comfort, but there's something tragic about industries built on helping people avoid the very experiences that might transform them. The words hit Sarah like cold water. Elena had identified the exact problem with the Henderson campaign. It was designed to help people consume wilderness experiences without being changed by them. Sarah's marketing genius lay in removing the transformational potential from outdoor recreation, packaging it as entertainment instead of education. Her phone rang at exactly 3 p.m. Dr. Maria Vasquez's voice carried the same combination of scientific precision and genuine warmth that Sarah had noticed in Elena's descriptions. "Jacob tells me you might be interested in conservation work," Maria said without preamble. "He's not usually wrong about people, but I have to admit I'm curious about someone making the jump from corporate marketing to non-profit environmental work." "I'm curious about it myself," Sarah replied honestly. "A few days ago I would have said it was impossible, but something changed for me up in the mountains." Maria laughed, a sound that carried understanding. "The mountains have a way of clarifying priorities, don't they? Jacob said you spent some time in Elena's Valley. That place has a reputation for causing career changes. You knew Elena." "She was one of my closest collaborators and dearest friends," Maria said, her voice softening. "A brilliant scientist. But more than that, she had a gift for helping people understand that human well-being and environmental health weren't separate issues. We lost something irreplaceable when she died." Sarah felt a connection forming across the phone line, a sense that this conversation was important in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. "Tell me about your organization," Sarah said. For the next 30 minutes, Maria outlined the work of the High Country Conservation Alliance with the passion of someone who'd found her life's calling. They worked to protect critical wildlife corridors, educated the public about climate change impacts on alpine ecosystems, and advocated for policy changes that would preserve high-altitude wilderness areas. "The science is solid," Maria explained. "We know exactly what needs to be done to protect these ecosystems. Our biggest challenge is translating that knowledge into action, getting policymakers to care about environments most people never see, convincing donors that invisible wildlife corridors deserve funding, helping the public understand that what happens at 11,000 feet affects everyone downstream." Sarah felt her strategic mind engaging with the challenge, but this time the excitement felt authentic rather than calculated. "What's your current communications approach?" "Scientific papers, educational presentations, the occasional newspaper op-ed," Maria admitted ruefully. "Elena used to tease me about speaking in jargon that only other biologists could understand. She was right. We're terrible at storytelling." As Maria described specific projects and ongoing challenges, Sarah began seeing marketing solutions that had nothing to do with selling products and everything to do with advancing causes that mattered. Wildlife corridors could be presented as wildlife highways. Climate adaptation could be framed as helping animals become climate refugees. High-altitude ecosystems could be marketed as the planet's early warning systems. I have to ask, Maria said, as their conversation wound down, what's driving your interest in this work? Career changes like this don't usually happen without something significant prompting them. Sarah looked out at the urban landscape visible from her office window, then down at Elena's journal open on her desk. I think I've been dead inside for a while without realizing it, she said quietly. Going through the motions of a successful life without actually living. The mountains reminded me what it feels like to be fully alive. And now I can't imagine going back to work. That doesn't matter. The honesty of her answer surprised even her. But Maria responded with immediate understanding. That's exactly what Elena would have said, Maria replied. She believed that environmental destruction and personal spiritual emptiness were symptoms of the same disconnection from what actually sustains us. Healing one requires healing the other. They arranged to meet in person later that week, after Sarah had handled her immediate professional obligations. As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized she'd just committed to a conversation that could change the fundamental direction of her life. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, dual consciousness. She attended meetings and responded to emails with professional competence, but her mind was processing possibilities that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Every marketing challenge Maria had described felt solvable, every communication barrier surmountable with the right strategic approach. At 6 p.m., Sarah found herself alone in her office, staring at two paths that seemed to diverge toward completely different futures. Tomorrow's Henderson presentation represented everything she'd worked toward: career advancement, financial success, professional recognition. But Maria's work offered something she'd forgotten was possible: the chance to use her talents for purposes that aligned with her deepest values. She opened Elena's journal and began writing, trying to capture the complexity of her situation. Standing at the crossroads between who I've been and who I might become. The safe path leads to everything I thought I wanted. The uncertain path leads toward everything I actually need. Elena wrote about geological forces that work slowly but inevitably, reshaping landscapes grain by grain. I think the same forces have been working on me. And tomorrow I'll find out whether I have the courage to trust the new terrain that's emerging. Outside her office window, the lights of Denver sparkled like terrestrial stars, beautiful but somehow diminished after seeing the Milky Way stretch across mountain skies. Sarah packed Elena's journal in her briefcase alongside the Henderson presentation materials. Two different approaches to living carried side by side. Tomorrow would demand a choice, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt ready to choose based on who she was becoming rather than who she used to be. The elevator down to the parking garage felt like descending from one world toward another, each floor carrying her further from the corporate strategist she'd been and closer to the person Jacob and Elena had helped her remember was possible. By the time she reached her car, Sarah realized she'd already made her decision. She just had to find the courage to act on it. Tuesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in Denver, the kind of weather that made the distant mountains visible from downtown office buildings. Sarah stood at her corner office window, watching the sun illuminate the peaks where she'd discovered a version of herself she'd forgotten could exist. In 2 hours, she would walk into the Henderson Group presentation that represented the culmination of everything she'd worked toward in her corporate career. But first, she had a different kind of meeting to attend. Sarah had requested 15 minutes with Marcus Whitfield before the client presentation, ostensibly to go over final details. In reality, she needed to have a conversation that would either liberate her from a life that no longer fit, or commit her more deeply to a path that felt increasingly like betrayal of her authentic self. Marcus arrived at his office at exactly 7:30 a.m., as he had every weekday for the past 8 years. His routine was legendary at Morrison & Associates, First to arrive, last to leave, living proof that success required complete devotion to professional excellence. Sarah had once admired his single-minded dedication. Now she wondered what he'd sacrificed to achieve it. "Ready for the big presentation?" Marcus asked, settling behind his desk with his usual morning coffee and stack of industry reports. "The partners are expecting this to be a career-defining moment for you. Career-defining." The phrase carried weight that felt different than it had just a week ago. Sarah realized that every moment was potentially career-defining, depending on which career you were trying to define. "Marcus, I need to tell you something before we go into that presentation," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "I've been offered an opportunity to work with a conservation organization in Colorado. Environmental marketing, focusing on wilderness protection and climate adaptation." Marcus looked up from his reports with the sharp attention of someone hearing unexpected information. "That's nice, Sarah, but we have the Henderson presentation in 90 minutes. Can we discuss your networking activities later?" "It's not networking. It's a job offer. A career change." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished fire. Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, his expression shifting from mild interest to focused concern. "Sarah, you're talking about walking away from a senior vice president position at one of the most prestigious marketing firms in the region. You're 32 years old and already earning more than most people see in a lifetime. This conservation work, what does it pay? Half of what you're making now? A quarter?" "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "We haven't discussed salary." "You haven't discussed salary." Marcus repeated the words as if they represented evidence of temporary insanity. "Sarah, I think the mountain air affected your judgment. You're experiencing what psychologists call post-vacation syndrome. Everything seems different when you return to normal life. But the feeling passes." Sarah had expected this reaction, but hearing it articulated made her realize how completely she'd moved beyond Marcus's frame of reference. His definition of normal life no longer applied to the person she was becoming. "It's not post-vacation syndrome," she said quietly. "It's post-awakening clarity. Listen to yourself. You sound like someone who's joined a cult." Marcus leaned forward across his desk, adopting the mentoring tone he used when guiding junior employees through career crises. "You've worked too hard to get where you are to throw it all away for some idealistic environmental cause. These non-profit jobs are for people who couldn't make it in the real business world." The dismissive comment about non-profit work sparked something protective in Sarah's chest. She thought about Dr. Maria Vasquez, whose scientific expertise and passionate dedication to conservation represented exactly the kind of meaningful achievement that Marcus's definition of success completely overlooked. What if the real business world isn't the only way to define a successful life? Sarah asked. "Then you're deluding yourself." Marcus's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd built his identity around a single definition of success. "Money is how society keeps score, Sarah. Everything else is just feel-good rhetoric that doesn't pay for retirement or your parents' medical bills or your children's education." 3 months later, Sarah stood on a ridge overlooking a valley that the High Country Conservation Alliance was working to protect from development. She wore clothes chosen for function rather than fashion, carried equipment selected for reliability rather than brand recognition, and felt more professionally fulfilled than she had in years. Her first major project involved creating communication strategies to build public support for wildlife corridor protection. Instead of selling products people didn't need, she was promoting causes that could preserve irreplaceable ecosystems for future generations. The work was challenging, the budgets were tight, and the victories came slowly, but each success felt authentic in ways her corporate achievements never had. "How does it feel to be poor?" Amanda Torres had asked during a recent phone call, only half joking about Sarah's salary reduction. "I've never felt richer," Sarah had replied, surprising them both with the honesty of the response. Her parents had indeed struggled to understand her career change, But their concern had gradually shifted to cautious pride as they saw her passion for work that aligned with her values. Her father had even begun incorporating Sarah's conservation projects into his environmental economics lectures, using her real-world experience to illustrate theoretical principles. The mountains remained her refuge and inspiration, offering perspective during challenging projects and reminding her of the larger purposes that motivated her work. She'd returned to Elena's Valley several times, always carrying the journal that had become both reference book and personal memoir. Jacob appeared on the ridge beside her with his usual quiet approach, Thor padding along behind them both. Their friendship had deepened over the months, built on shared understanding of how the mountains could transform people willing to listen to their teachings. "How's the Wildlife Corridor campaign progressing?" Jacob asked, settling onto a boulder that offered panoramic views of the valley below. "Better than expected. We've secured initial funding and regulatory support. The real challenge now is maintaining public interest long enough to complete the land acquisitions." "Elena would be proud of this work," Jacob said, watching a hawk circle high above them. She always believed that protecting wilderness required both scientific knowledge and strategic communication. "You're providing the bridge between those worlds." Sarah opened Elena's journal and added her latest observations about wildlife movement patterns and habitat connectivity. Her handwriting had evolved to fit comfortably alongside Elena's scientific notations, creating a collaborative record that spanned years and perspectives. "Jacob, I need to tell you something," Sarah said, closing the journal and meeting his eyes directly. "That night you found me lost in the wilderness. When I said I was already dead inside, I meant it completely. I felt like I'd lost everything that made life worth living. And now," Sarah looked across the valley, watching shadows move across mountain faces as clouds drifted overhead. Wildlife corridors would soon connect these ridges to other protected areas, allowing animals to migrate freely across landscapes that development might otherwise fragment. Her marketing strategies would help make that vision reality, using skills she'd developed in corporate boardrooms to advance causes that mattered to her soul. "Now I understand what you meant about death not being permanent in the mountains," she said. "Sometimes things need to die so other things can live. Old ways of seeing, old definitions of success, old fears about stepping into uncertainty. The woman who got lost on that trail doesn't exist anymore," Jacob observed. "No," Sarah agreed, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest like warmth from a campfire. "She doesn't, but the woman who replaced her is someone I actually recognize, someone I'm proud to become." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day progress across the mountainscape that had taught them both about transformation and renewal. In the distance, Sarah could see hikers moving along trails that would soon connect to protected corridors. Their journeys made possible by conservation work that bridged scientific expertise with strategic communication. She was no longer dead inside. The mountains had proved her wrong about that, and every day of meaningful work continued proving her wrong about the limitations she'd once accepted as permanent. The hidden valley existed not just in geography, but in the space between who she'd been and who she was becoming, a space filled with possibility and purpose she'd never imagined possible. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Sarah opened Elena's journal one final time and wrote, "Found my way back to life today. Not the life I thought I wanted, but the life I actually needed. The mountains taught me that death and rebirth aren't one-time events. They're ongoing processes of shedding what no longer serves and embracing what calls to our deepest truth. I'm no longer the woman who whispered she was dead inside. I'm the woman who learned to listen when the wilderness whispered back, not dead, just sleeping. Time to wake up." The words felt like completion and beginning simultaneously, marking the end of one story and the start of another that would continue writing itself across mountain ridges and hidden valleys for years to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.